We want to pick up our study in the Old Testament book of Hosea in chapter 11 today. So I encourage you to open your Bibles there, or you can follow along on the screen if you so choose. In the final four chapters of the book of Hosea, we see a shift, if you will, to the theme of God's intense love for Israel. God had always loved Israel as a parent loves a stubborn child, and that's why he would not release her from the consequences of her behavior. The Israelites were sinful, and they would be punished like a rebellious son brought by his parents before the elders. You can read about that principle in the old law in Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 21. Very serious consequences. All through Israel's sad history, God repeatedly offered to restore the nation if they would only turn back to him. By stubbornly refusing God's invitation, the northern kingdom had sealed its doom. It would be destroyed, never to rise again. Even so, Israel as a nation was not finished. A remnant of faithful Israelites would return to God, who would send the Messiah with a new covenant offering pardon and reconciliation to all who would follow him. In structure, this chapter shifts from the past to the present to an immediate future, and then finally to the distant future. In verses 1 through 4, we have God referring to the past, his calling of Israel, and again, their rebellion. Then in verses 5 through 7, we have the present and immediate future for the northern kingdom. It discusses the present threat to Israel from Assyria for their continued rebellion. And then finally, verses 8 through 11, we have God through Hosea speaking of the distant future. And of course, that references God's refusal to utterly destroy Israel, and of course, giving them a promise of restoration in what the Bible refers to as the last days. All right, let's work our way into the text. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So in retrospective and tender language, God describes his people in terms of their origins as a nation. Here, the allegory chosen to convey the mood is close to the heart. Israel is referred to as a son. God's words here are best understood in light of Exodus 4, verses 22 and 23, the commission from God to Moses at the very beginning of his journey to Egypt to lead the Exodus. Exodus 4, verses 22 through 23 says this. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I said to you, let my son go, that he may serve me, but you have refused to let him go. Behold, I will kill your son, your firstborn. So Hosea and Exodus both link the adoption of Israel to sonship with the liberation from Egypt, the emphasis being placed on the very first dealings of God with his infant nation. God says that he called his son out of Egypt there at the end of verse 1. The word call here is used in a variety of senses in the Old Testament as in modern English. Here the emphasis is only partly upon God's election or choosing or adoption of Israel. The context here in this chapter suggests that summon or gather is also intended, and the statement must be seen in light of divine guidance and protection. It is in this latter sense, the sense of summoning or gathering, that the first part of verse 1 functions as a messianic prophecy. A second special exodus from Egypt, that of the child Jesus after his death of Herod, and that's in Matthew 2, verse 15. Matthew, in speaking of Jesus coming out of Egypt as a child, God sent Jesus and his parents to Egypt to escape the wrath of King Herod. Matthew quotes from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, and applies the message there to Jesus. So in essence, the text is doing double duty. It has its own meaning here in chapter 11, verse 1, in a context which does not concern itself with the Messiah. Of course, it has as well a fuller sense deriving from the double potential of specific wording chosen. Events in Jesus's life thus fulfill, for example, complete the potential meanings of the wording of chapter 11, verse 1, the latter part of the verse, while not constituting its sole referent. All right, verse 2. God says, the more they called them, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to idols. So in contrast to God's intense love, the essence of Israel's rebellion is expressed here in two ways. First of all, they refused to respond to God's call through the prophets. Second of all, they showed this refusal by worshiping the Baals and other false gods specifically forbidden to them in the law. Thus, Israel committed sins both of omission and commission, leaving undone what they should have done. Of course, that's answer God's call, and doing what they should not. And of course, that's worshiping the false gods. Israel, through both omission and commission, showed themselves to be stubbornly rebellious. God mercifully loved his son Israel and helped him leave Egypt. Israel responded with rebellion. There is no corresponding attitude or action on Israel's part to the attitude and action of his loving father. In the metaphor of a New Testament story, the son has, as it were, left home and spent his fortune on riotous living with the false gods. And of course, we're thinking here of the story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. Israel chose new gods, thereby breaking the most basic rule of the covenant. You will have no other gods besides me, God said in Exodus 20, verse 3. Israel violated the covenant in making idols of these gods, Exodus 20, verse 23, and Exodus 34, verse 17, as well as sacrificing to them once they were made. Compare Exodus 22, verse 20. Could the case against Israel as a rebellious child be any more condemning? I don't think so. Verse 3. Yet, God says, it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. So again, the fault here is in no way God's. Using the metaphor of a tender, patient parent training a child to walk, God proclaims his innocence. There is both an irony and a pathos in these words. God had held little Ephraim's hands as Ephraim took its first hesitant steps and cared for him when he was sick. Exodus 15, verse 26 says, again in connection with the Exodus event, and he said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. But in spite of God's tender reaching out and healing, Ephraim did not even acknowledge God's compassionate attention. Israel could not see that God had been the key to their well-being as he taught them to walk through their history, holding them by the hand. Upon reaching adolescence, they showed themselves to be ingrates, unconcerned to fulfill their calling to sonship. Though God had guided them out of Egypt and through the wilderness, faithfully healing their afflictions, his loving care had gone for naught. Verse 4, Hosea 11:4. God says, I led them with cords of a man, with bonds of love, and I became to them as one who lifts the yoke from their jaws, and I bent down and fed them. This imagery pictured in this verse, of course, illustrates further the benevolence of God toward Israel in the Exodus and in the wilderness. The yoke, of course, is the symbol of oppression and or servitude in the covenant vocabulary. See it in places like Leviticus 26, verse 13, where God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt so that you would not be their slaves, and I broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk upright or erect. And later in Deuteronomy 28, verse 48, there in punishment, as it mentions there, due to their not adhering to the terms of the covenant, it says, therefore you shall serve your enemies whom the Lord will send against you in hunger and thirst and nakedness and in the lack of all things, and he will put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. So Israel's rescue from the house of bondage in the time of Egypt is like the lifting of a yoke from the jaw of an animal. The reference to reaching out and feeding the animal probably symbolizes the constant presence of God with Israel and his feeding of them, even miraculously. The verse, as a sum here, is a masterful illustration of divine grace and condescension. Verse 5, they will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria, he will be their king because they refused to return to me. So suddenly here we come to the second section here in chapter 11 of God, speaking of the present, verses 1 through 4 talked about the history. God says how he provided for them throughout history. Now, starting in verse 5 through verse 7, God here talks about the present. Excuse me. They will not return to me, and return rather to the land of Egypt, but Assyria. He will be their king because they refuse to return to me. Suddenly, the extended metaphors of past history stopped, and Hosea's audience hears of their soon coming punishment. The blunt reality of exile and servitude is brought home to them. Assyria is specified as the nation who will dominate the captured and exiled Israelites. Assyria here is called Israel's future king. Though tersely worded, this surely implies the end of the kingship and national sovereignty of Israel. We've seen that mentioned several times in the book of Hosea, back in chapter 3, verse 4, and 7, verse 7, chapter 10, verses 3, 7, and 15, as well as chapter 13, verse 11, when we eventually get there. The king of Assyria, it was obliquely referred to as the great king in Hosea 5:13 and Hosea 10:6 in just a moment. But now the Assyrian nation itself is identified as Israel's coming king. In contrast to the days when Israel was carried tenderly by their father master, the coming days will bring the fulfillment of his promised wrath. Their flagrant apostasy, as we saw in verse 2, is summarized in reference to their stubbornness. They refuse to return, not to Egypt, about which they will have no choice, but to God, from whom they have fallen away. What God rescued his people from, and of course that was slavery, he will return them to because of their disloyalty to his covenant. For the third time in this section, we saw it in verse 2 and in the last part of verse 3, we now read a description of how God's love, expressed also 3 times in verse 1, 3, and 4, is spurned. Verse 6, the sword, God says, will whirl against their cities. They will demolish their gate bars and consume them because of their counsels. So the Israelites will become subject to Assyria by being conquered in a bloody war. The 3 lines of the verse emphasize destruction. Warfare, or as it says, by means of the sword, will occur in the various cities. In times of war, of course, people gather from the countryside into the cities, which were surrounded by fortifications, high, thick walls topped by fortified battle stations. For God to announce through Hosea that the battle would reach to the inside of the cities was a way of saying that the Assyrians would breach the Israelite fortification, enter the cities, and kill their inhabitants. There is a translational issue in the middle of the verse where it says in my New American Standard, and will demolish their gate bars. The NIV has devour their false prophets, and the King James has he shall consume his branches. But regardless, the point here in context in the verse is that the destructive sword of the Lord, which would be Assyria, will come upon the northern kingdom for their sin and rebellion. Verse 7, so my people are bent on turning from me, though they call them to the one on high, no, none at all exalts him. This verse continues the theme of Israel's stubborn unfaithfulness. It restates the utter infidelity of the nation and their unified apostasy from God in favor of false gods. My version says they're bent on turning from God. Back in chapter 4 of Hosea, verse 16, Israel was referred to as a stubborn heifer. That's the stubbornness. In Jeremiah 8, verse 5, Jeremiah is prophesying to the southern kingdom, has the same idea. It says, why then has this people, Jerusalem, turned away in continual apostasy? They hold fast to deceit, they refuse to return. And that's where Israel was here in the north, continual hypocrisy and rebellion. The they of them in this verse, when it says, though they call upon them from the one on high, would be the prophets of God who worked hard to call them to turn back to God. Verse 8. Excuse me. God says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. So a sudden shift provides hope for Israel. And this is the final of the three sections in Hosea 11, speaking, if you will, of the distant hope for the people of Israel. After Israel's full punishment for disloyalty has taken place, and that, of course, as we've seen over and over, was going to be through a serious conquest and exile of Israel, eventually God will restore his people. This follows the pattern of events predicted in Deuteronomy 4, verses 25 through 31. Verses 8 through 11 here in Hosea 11 renews that promise. Let me read for you Hosea 4, or Deuteronomy 4, verses 25 through 31. Again, through Moses, God, several centuries earlier, had warned the people of a judgment that would come because of their rebellion. He says, when you become the father of children and children's children, and have remained long in the land, and act corruptly, and make an idol in the form of anything to do that which is evil in the sight of the Lord your God, so as to provoke him to anger, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that you will surely perish quickly from the land where you're going over the Jordan to possess it. You shall not live long on it, but will be utterly destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number, and among the nations, few in number, rather, among the nations where the Lord drives you. There you will serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. So again, that's recounting the history we're studying right now in Hosea, God exiling his people for their sin. But Deuteronomy 4, verse 29, God holds out this olive branch of hope. But from there, you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him if you search for him with all your heart and soul. When you are in distress and all these things have come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and listen to his voice. For the Lord your God is a compassionate God. He will not fail you, nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant with your fathers, which he swore to them. So you see, as God says here in verse 8, he could never finally give up or hand over Israel or Ephraim. He will not do to his own people what he did to Admah and Zeboim. The reference here, when God says, how can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? These cities, of course, were obliterated by God along with Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 14, chapter 10 and verse 14. And that's Admah and Zeboim are mentioned there in a sudden destruction. There God destroyed all those cities in a sudden destruction of divine wrath. The covenant curses mentioned these four cities, Deuteronomy 29, verse 23, as paradigms for what could happen to Israel if they obeyed the covenant. Israel's destruction would leave behind only waste as a reminder of what happens to nations who defy God. But God says that he will not take his punishment to an extreme. Why? Because his heart has changed, and his change of heart moves him to mercy. Here again, we saw it back in the last part of verse 8. The second line of the couplet explains the first line. God's change of mind, the idiom is virtually identical to the English way of saying it, is a product not of whim or circumstance, but of his eternally consistent nature. He is a compassionate God whose basic desire toward his people is to win them back to himself or to restore them. Verse 9, God says, I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. So God has every right under the covenant, as we've seen several times, to eliminate Israel from the earth. As the fourfold use of not in this verse indicates, he will not do that. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again. He would be justified, of course, in carrying out his fierce anger, destroying Ephraim and coming at them in wrath. God announces that he will restore Israel because his character is different from humans. God is not one of the Israelites whose emotions might reflect arbitrary passions and whose wrath might be vindictive rather than equitable. As the verse reminds them and us, he is God, the Holy One. To be holy is to be set apart from typical human beings so as to reflect godlikeness. Of course, God himself is the essence of godlikeness. From a human point of view, however, his holiness embodies all that makes him different from humans, and especially the qualities that elevate his thinking and moral behavior above their usual petty standards. I would just say how thankful we can be that God is not like us so very often. This is not a promise, I would remind everyone again, of mercy for those alive in Hosea's day, but for their descendants, the remnant that will follow. God has been insistent up to this point that the Israelites of Hosea's day will go into captivity and experience destruction. To righteous followers of the covenant, those who heeded Hosea's message, the remnant, if you will, they are the ones God is speaking to here. This would be a source of great encouragement even for these Israelites as they think, well, it'll be better for my kids. Verse 10, God says, they will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar, and his sons will come trembling from the west. One day in the future, the distant future at this point, Israel will return to God and then be able to return from exile. Their punishment will end as promised through Moses. The message of verse 10 is that God himself will announce this return upon their repentance. The roaring of God like a lion seems to function as a symbolic representation of his calling people to hear his judgment. When the great lion who is God roars, no one will fail to hear, and the restoration of Israel will be at hand. You can see references in other prophets in places like Joel 4, verse 16, and Amos chapter 1, verse 2, and chapter 3, verse 8. But the restoration promised here, again, will apply to repentant Israelites only. Thus, the first condition is stated, after God they shall go, or they will walk after the Lord. Thus, the first condition is repentance. The new Israel will be characterized by righteous behavior and true faith. We reference Zephaniah 3, verses 12 and 13. Verse 11. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will settle them in their houses, declares the Lord. Israel will finally make their way home. When the return commences, nothing can stop it. Now would be fulfilled the promise way back in Hosea 2, verse 25, where God said, I will plant her for myself in the land. The covenant restoration blessing of return from exile will come to pass for Israel. When we studied Hosea 3, we saw in verse 5 where it says, afterward the sons of Israel will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king, and they will come trembling to the Lord and to his goodness in the last days. So once again, I would remind you, these are all last days prophecy. The last days, of course, as we've studied before, being the establishment of a new covenant and the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. Finally, for this chapter, verse 12. Ephraim surrounds me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. Judah is also unruly against God, even against the Holy One who is faithful. The chapter break here would have been better placed after verse 11, because this verse fits the tone of what follows in chapter 12. I would remind everyone again, the chapter breaks in our English Bibles were given much, much later than the original writings. So Hosea was originally just one long writing without verses or chapter breaks. But the text here, starting in verse 12, once again turns to God's indictment of Israel for their sins, and we'll see that carried on as we get into chapter 12. God here laments that he is besieged by the treachery of his people. We got the phrase there, the first part of verse 12, Ephraim surrounds me with lies. It's as if God is under siege. Ephraim and Israel rather, has encircled their own God as an army encircles a city. Their weapons, as the verse says, are deceit and fraud. Israel's deceit and fraud are found in their cheating on the covenant. Though enamored with Baal and Asherah, Ephraim is still pledged allegiance to its national God while ignoring his covenant. Their actions show that they were deceivers. Judah is also, or will be, guilty of unfaithfulness to God, the Holy One. In effect, then, wherever God looked, he was surrounded by cheaters. Got this reference at the end of verse 12 to Judah is also unruly. Judah's time will come. Even Judah, with its legal central sanctuary in Jerusalem, with its Davidic kingship and legitimate priesthood, was steadily corrupting itself and would become unruly. God alone was faithful and honest to the covenant, and the dust settles, while Ephraim and Judah only pretended to be in many instances. The mention of Judah is unintrusive here, and not merely because Hosea's audience would naturally be concerned about the southern kingdom and its fate. The chapter is interested in the whole of God's people. Yes, the primary target of God's words is the northern kingdom here, but Judah is never far from his mind as well. So this has been a good chapter, at least to get a glimmer of hope, and we've seen a few of those, not many, in the book of Hosea. This chapter reveals, again, the heart of God. It's so compassionate and so willing to bend if possible, and that gives ultimate hope to the people of God, the faithful remnant. All right, let me encourage you to study ahead into chapter 12. And Lord willing, we'll pick up with that in our next study together. God bless and continue to learn.